TPP from a slightly different perspective. So most people talk about the TPP as an economic arrangement that is good for advances corporate profits at the expense of workers, and there's no disagreement about that. But I'm going to talk about how the TPP is also a tool for geopolitical control in the region, meaning that it's about the contest between the US and China about who controls the region. It is an agreement that is very divisive for the region and has serious consequences for the region geopolitically, and why it's important for people in the Asia Pacific as well as people in the United States to fight together to oppose the TPP. So my presentation is going to start from, I'm going to give a little background. I think this is a history that most people are familiar with. I'm going to go back to China's industrialization in the past 2-3 decades. So most people know since the 1980s, China has rapidly industrialized its economy, and it's become the fastest growing economy in the world. It is now the largest global exporter and the second largest importer, second only to the United States. So what this means is that this meant dramatic changes for people inside China, but also huge changes for the entire region as a whole. I remember I grew up in the Midwest in South Bend, Indiana, and aside from Notre Dame University, the only other industry there was manufacturing of auto parts and components. And Detroit was obviously the hub of auto manufacturing, but a lot of the cities around there in the Midwest, they were all making parts and components, and they were all being sent to Detroit and where it got assembled. So China is like the Detroit of Asia, right? So all the smaller countries surrounding China are all making parts and components, mainly for IT products, electronic products, and all of that gets sent to China, which is the hub where it all gets assembled and then exported out, mostly to the United States, right? So what this meant was that China's growth also meant fast growth, industrialization for all the other countries surrounding it. So that was good in a way for the economies of the surrounding countries. However, it also meant that all the other countries became very dependent on China's economy. So just like all the cities in the Midwest became so dependent on Detroit, if Detroit failed, then everybody else failed because they didn't have any other economy or industry of their own, right? So all the other countries surrounding China became very worried. We're going to just become subsumed under China's economy, and we're not going to have our own industries. If China fails, we go down together. And if the United States economy declines and there's less demand for Chinese products, then China's economy stagnates, and then that means the entire region also declines, right? So a group of countries called the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, they started to worry about this, and they formed an economic bloc. And I was going to ask you if you can name the 10 countries in ASEAN, but we don't have time for that, so I'm just going to tell you the countries on the screen. So Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, you can see on the map, these are all the countries, 10 countries who are part of this bloc. And in 2007, they got together and they said, we're going to form an ASEAN economic community by 2015. And what they started to do as a bloc is they negotiated bilaterally with the bigger economies in the region, with China, with Korea, with Japan, and they started to create a network of free trade agreements with itself in the center. They said, if we're going to go down this road, we want to have a say, we want to control how this happens and not be subsumed under these larger economies. So that's what was going on in Asia. Now, meanwhile, in the United States, the US faces an economic crisis, and it's hard to get out of it. And the US looks across the Pacific and sees this huge land of opportunity and says, we got to be part of that. There's lots of money to be made there. So in 2011, this was President Obama's statement in Australia. He said, as the world's fastest growing region, home to more than half the global economy, the Asia Pacific is critical to achieving my highest priority, creating jobs and opportunities for the American people. He doesn't really mean the last priority, it's creating opportunities for US corporations. So what he did was he declared what's called the Pivot to Asia Doctrine, which basically means the Asia Pacific is going to be now a priority region for the United States, and it's going to spend, do what it has to do militarily, economically, diplomatically, in order to make sure that U.S. is in control of the region. So part of it was a military shift, so shifting 60% of the U.S. Navy to the Pacific region, also creating a network of U.S. bases, basically encircling China so that, and this is the map that you're seeing here, it's too small for you to see probably, but basically all of those dots on the map are where the U.S. has military bases, and you can see that it's encircling China, so to make sure that it's the U.S. that's in control of the sea lanes and the trade routes, military exercises, and forging new military alliances with all the little countries in the region. Part of it also involves fueling and fanning territorial disputes. So historically in the region, there are disputes between many countries, especially smaller countries with China about territories, about small islands in the sea. It's not really about the islands that are uninhabited, but it's really about the oil and natural resources under the sea around these islands. And the U.S. is basically egging these disputes on and saying, you see, this is why China is such a bully in the region. This is why you need us, our presence in the region, because you need us to counter China's bad behavior. The other thing that's very worrisome is that the United States is also backing very unsavory rulers in the region. The guy on the right is Abe. He is the current president of Japan. He's also the grandson of a Class A war criminal. The woman on the left is the current president of South Korea. She is the daughter of a former military dictator. So they're now ruling these countries, and the United States is very close with these rulers to basically implement this pivot to Asia policy. It would be almost like if Mubarak's daughter went back into office 20 years later, and the United States would be supporting that. And then there's the TPP. So how I look at the TPP is that it's also part of this grand strategy, U.S. strategy in the region. And President Obama basically said so in his presidential debate against Romney in 2012. He said, we're organizing trade relations with countries other than China, so that China starts feeling more pressure about meeting basic international standards. That's the kind of leadership we've shown in the region. And the TPP, if you look at the text of the agreement, it has a lot of language that's really about excluding China. Strict international intellectual property protections, rules against anti-competitive state-owned enterprises. These are all things that are really targeting China, and these are standards that is impossible for China to meet. So what the U.S. strategy is with TPP is first create its own bloc with certain countries in the region that is friendly to the United States, undermines China's influence, and then say, look, all these other countries are agreeing to these rules. Now China, you have to also agree to this rule, and then try to force China into a position where it has to join. However, the TPP is geopolitically very divisive for the region because some countries in the region are part of the TPP, other countries are not. And so it basically divides the region in half. So now ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations that was trying to create an economic bloc and trying to lead the integration of the region, says, wait a minute, this is not good for us because basically what the TPP is trying to do is divide us in half, and then it's going to marginalize us as a bloc. So then in 2012, ASEAN said, we're going to propose a different kind of economic agreement, and that's called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership as an alternative to the TPP. So China looks at the situation and says, oh, great, we welcome RCEP, and we're going to give our full support to this and accelerate this process. So what's happening now is that there are two agreements in the region that are competing, TPP and the RCEP. And countries are trying to decide, should we join one or the other? I can talk about the differences about the two agreements, but I don't think we have time, so I'm going to skip over this part. This is the map of who's part of TPP and who's part of RCEP. Skip over that. The TPP's ultimate aim is to create what they're calling the free trade area of the Asia Pacific. So they basically want the entire region open to free cross-border travel of capital in the region. However, as I said, it's very problematic because one, it ignores uneven development in the region, different interests of the countries in the region, and it's very divisive because it's built into the TPP fundamentally as a spirit of confrontation and containment, and it's not really about economic cooperation and partnership. So for a long time, for decades, people in Asia Pacific have been fighting for sovereignty, fighting for the right to self-determination without foreign influence, to determine for our own future, and for a long time, the people of the United States have been in support of those struggles and in solidarity. And I think the TPP is a great opportunity for people in Asia Pacific as well as in the United States to stand together,